The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel smelled like excessive wealth. Thousands of white lilies decorated the stage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ego. High-definition cameras tracked every movement. This was the SR8 global launch. It was the most anticipated tech event of the year. Julian stood under the spotlight. His teeth were perfectly white. His smile was practiced. He adjusted the cuffs of his $3,000 custom charcoal suit. He looked like a god. He was the genius scientist. He was the savior of the skincare industry. The SR8 polymer is my gift to the world. Julian's voice boomed through the speakers. I spent 5 lonely years in the lab. I worked until my hands bled. I sacrificed everything for this formula. In the shadows of the wings, Evelyn stood alone. She was dressed in a beige suit that was 3 seasons old. It was frayed at the edges. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, messy bun. She held a tablet with trembling hands. She was the executive assistant. That was the title Julian gave her. In reality, she was the brain. She was the one who actually bled. Julian hadn't stepped into a lab in half a decade. He couldn't even explain the molecular weight of the polymer he was holding. Julian glanced toward the wings. He saw her. His eyes didn't show love. They showed irritation. He tapped his earpiece. Evelyn, the slide on screen 4 is half a second late. His voice hissed in her ear. You're making me look like an amateur. Pay attention, you mouse. The insult hit her like a physical slap. Mouse. That was his favorite word for her lately. An hour ago, Evelyn had been in the VIP dressing room. She wanted to surprise Julian with a good luck charm. Instead, she found him. He was pinned against a mirror by a 20-year-old runway model. Julian's hands were everywhere. Don't worry about my wife. Julian had laughed into the model's neck. Evelyn is just the help. She has nowhere else to go. She's a plain, boring tool. I use her for her brain, and I use you for my pleasure. It's a perfect balance. The model had giggled. But isn't the patent in her name? Julian's voice had turned sharp. It was, but she's soft. She signed the 5-year transfer yesterday because I told her I wanted to build a future for our children. There are no children, baby. There is only the money. Evelyn watched Julian on the stage now. He was holding up a crystal bottle. The serum inside glowed a faint, ethereal blue. It was beautiful. It was hers. She had created it in her basement during the first year of their marriage. She had sold her mother's jewelry to buy the centrifuge. She had skipped meals to afford the raw materials. Julian had used that time to network at golf clubs. This is a $10 billion breakthrough, Julian shouted to the crowd. The applause was deafening. And tonight, we sign the global distribution deal with the International Integrity Commission. The proctor, a man in a stiff grey suit, walked onto the stage. He held a digital ledger. This was the moment of Julian's ultimate triumph. Suddenly, the air in the ballroom felt heavy. The massive oak doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they were slammed open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The applause died instantly. A man walked in. He was taller than Julian. He was broader. He wore a navy blue suit that cost more than Julian's entire car collection. His footsteps were heavy and rhythmic on the marble floor. Clack, clack, clack. It was Alexander Vance, the asset pricer, the man who owned the banks that owned the world. He didn't look at the stage. He didn't look at the cameras. He walked straight toward the dark, unlit corner of the backstage area. He walked straight toward Evelyn. Julian's face went pale. Mr. Vance, you're early. We were just about to sign. Alexander ignored him. He stopped inches away from Evelyn. The space around them suddenly felt very small. Alexander smelled like cold mountain air and expensive sandalwood. He reached out. His large, warm hand settled firmly on the small of Evelyn's back. It was a possessive, heavy touch. He leaned down. His lips were an inch from her ear. You look tired, Evelyn. Alexander's voice was a low, vibrating growl. It sent a shiver down her spine. Why are you standing in the dark while a thief wears your crown? Evelyn looked up into his icy blue eyes. I was waiting for the right moment, she whispered. Alexander's hand moved. He gripped her waist and pulled her out of the shadows. He pulled her into the center of the stage. The bright white lights blinded her for a second. The moment is here, Alexander said. He looked at Julian. His eyes were like 2 daggers. And I brought the guillotine. Julian's face went from pale to a sickly shade of grey. He looked at Alexander. Then he looked at the thousands of flashing cameras. He tried to laugh. It was a dry, cracking sound. "Mr. Vance, you're joking," Julian said. He took a step toward Evelyn. He tried to grab her arm. "This woman is my wife. She's confused. She's been under a lot of stress. Evelyn, honey, stop this nonsense and go back to the office." That was the wound. He was gaslighting her in front of millions. He was calling her confused to protect his stolen throne. Alexander didn't wait. Before Julian's hand could touch Evelyn's sleeve, Alexander moved. He didn't use much effort. He simply stepped into Julian's personal space. Alexander was a head taller. His shadow swallowed Julian whole. Alexander grabbed Julian's wrist in midair. Crunch. The sound of Julian's expensive gold watch straining against his skin was audible through the stage microphones. "I don't like people touching what belongs to me," Alexander whispered. His voice was like a heavy velvet curtain. It was smooth, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Alexander pulled Evelyn closer. He didn't just stand near her. He tucked her firmly against his side. His hand moved to the nape of her neck. His thumb brushed against her skin. It was hot. It was possessive. It was the cure. Evelyn felt the hum of Alexander's heartbeat through his suit jacket. It was steady. It was dangerous. "Evelyn belongs to no one but her own genius," Alexander added. He looked at Julian with pure disgust. "And you are just a temporary occupant of a chair that is about to disappear." Julian stumbled back. "The chair is mine. The brand is mine." He turned to the proctor. "Sir, look at the documents. SR8 owns the global rights." The proctor looked at his tablet. He frowned. "Mr. Julian, there seems to be a technical error. The cloud servers are not responding." Evelyn finally spoke. She held up her cracked smartphone. "It's not an error, Julian. It's a revocation." She tapped a single red icon on the screen. Immediately, the massive 8K screens behind them changed. The beautiful high-tech animation of the SR8 polymer dissolved. It was replaced by a flickering error message. "Access denied. Patent owner revoked authorization." On the pedestal, the serum began to react. Without the cloud-stabilized frequency from the lab's server, the chemical bonds broke. The glowing blue liquid suddenly turned into a murky, yellowish foam. It began to bubble. A sharp, acidic smell filled the front rows of the audience. It smelled like vinegar and burnt plastic. This was the sensory flip. The luxury fragrance of the brand was dead. "What is that smell?" a reporter shouted. "The serum is melting," another yelled. Julian ran to the pedestal. He tried to cover the bubbling mess with his hands. "No, it's a hack. Someone is hacking my presentation." "It's not a hack," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm. It was the calm of a woman who had just set a house on fire. "The SR8 only works because of a specific molecular bridge. I hold the patent for that bridge. And 5 minutes ago, I withdrew my consent for its use." The crowd erupted. The live stream chat was moving so fast it was a blur of red emojis. "Fraud. The CEO is a fake. The assistant is the real creator." Julian turned to the cameras. He was sweating now. Dark circles of moisture appeared under the arms of his $3,000 suit. He looked like a cornered rat. "Evelyn, you can't do this," Julian screamed. "We have a contract. I pawned the assets. If this fails, the company owes $10 billion in penalties." "I know," Evelyn said. She looked at Julian's limited edition watch on the floor. "And I also know that you used my personal credit card to pay for the down payment on that mistress's penthouse in Paris. I saw the bank statements this morning, Julian. The status flip was complete. Julian was no longer the king of tech. He was a thief caught with his hand in the jar." Alexander Vance looked at Julian. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence was the ultimate humiliation. Alexander reached into his pocket. He pulled out a silk handkerchief. He wiped a small speck of the yellow foam off Evelyn's hand. He did it slowly. He did it like she was the only thing that mattered in the room. "The trash is leaking, Evelyn," Alexander said. He looked at the proctor. "I believe the Integrity Commission has rules about corporate theft and spousal fraud." The proctor stood up. His face was stone. "Mr. Julian, your assets are frozen, effective immediately. Security, please secure the perimeter. No one leaves until the audit is complete." Julian fell to his knees. The yellow foam was now dripping onto his expensive shoes. He looked up at Evelyn. For the first time, he saw the Ghost Queen for who she really was. She wasn't a mouse. She was the one who had been holding the cage door open, and she just stepped out, Julian scrambled to his feet. He wiped the yellow foam onto his pants. It left a permanent, ugly stain. "You think you won?" Julian shrieked. He pointed a trembling finger at the audience. "I have contracts. I have the global distribution rights signed with the European cartels. Even without the patent, they owe me billions in advance payments." He reached for his phone. He needed to call his bankers. He needed to move the money before the accounts froze. But his phone screen was black. He pressed the power button. Nothing. "Looking for your offshore accounts, Julian?" Alexander asked. Alexander stepped forward. His shadow stretched across the stage. It looked like a giant beast swallowing Julian's tiny figure. Alexander pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He tapped a single key. The audio system of the ballroom crackled. A cold female voice filled the hall. "Vance Capital has completed the acquisition of all outstanding debts for SR8 Global. Total liability, $12 billion. Status default." Julian's phone finally flickered to life. It didn't show his bank balance. It showed a red notification from the International Credit Bureau. His credit score had dropped to 0. "I didn't just buy your company's debt, Julian," Alexander said. He walked slowly around Julian. He was like a shark circling a bleeding fish. "I bought your personal debt, the money you borrowed from the sharks, the ones who break legs when they aren't paid. I bought those contracts too." Alexander stopped. He leaned in close to Julian. The smell of Alexander's leather gloves was cold and sharp. "I am now your only creditor. You don't owe the bank, you owe me." This was the wound. Julian realized he wasn't just losing a company, he was losing his freedom. "Evelyn," Julian turned to her. He fell to his knees again. He tried to grab the hem of her corsasoptode. "Tell him to stop. We were a team. I did all of this for us. You're my wife. You have to help me." Alexander didn't wait for Evelyn to move. He placed his heavy, polished boot on Julian's shoulder. He didn't push hard, but the message was clear. Julian was trash. "Don't touch her," Alexander growled. His voice was low and dangerous. Alexander turned back to Evelyn. His expression softened instantly. He reached out and cupped her face. His thumb moved slowly across her lower lip. His skin was warm. It felt like a promise of safety. This was the cure. "He's trying to use your heart as a weapon, Evelyn," Alexander whispered. "But he forgot one thing. Your heart isn't in this room anymore. It's with me." Alexander looked at the proctor. "Is the restriction order ready?" The proctor stepped forward. He held a digital warrant. "Julian, under the International Integrity Act, you are now under a Level 1 travel ban. Your passport is deactivated. Your social security number is flagged. You are restricted to a 10-mile radius of this city until your $12 billion debt is cleared." Julian's eyes were wide and bloodshot. $12 billion? I can't pay that in 100 years. "Exactly," Alexander said. He smiled. It was a cold, beautiful smile. "I don't want your money, Julian. I want your time. Every second of your miserable life now belongs to my collection department." Alexander turned to the cameras. He held Evelyn's hand. He raised it high for the world to see. "Tonight, the fraud is over. The real architect has returned, and I am officially announcing the merger of Evelyn's private lab with the Vance Group." The sexual tension in the room was suffocating. Alexander didn't wait for the applause. He leaned down and kissed Evelyn's knuckles. It was a slow, deep kiss. He looked her in the eyes while he did it. He was claiming her in front of millions. Julian watched them. He saw the way Alexander looked at Evelyn. It was a look of pure, hungry respect. Julian had never looked at her that way. He had only seen a tool. Now, the tool was a queen, and Julian was just a ghost. "Take him away," Alexander said. Security guards grabbed Julian by his arms. They dragged him across the stage. His socks slid on the marble floor. His $3,000 suit was ripped at the seams. He looked like a broken doll. "Wait, Evelyn, please." Julian's screams faded as the heavy doors at the back of the hall slammed shut. The grand ballroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. On the giant 8K monitors, the SR8 logo flickered one last time and died. It was replaced by a sterile, white screen. A single line of code ran across the display. "Antony Julian Moss data purge complete." Every article, every interview, and every social media post featuring Julian's face began to vanish in real time. To the digital world, he was being erased. To the physical world, he was already a corpse. "Wait, my clothes." Julian's voice cracked in the hallway outside. Alexander gestured to the guards. He's right. Those clothes don't belong to a ghost. The guards didn't hesitate. They didn't care about the cameras still broadcasting to millions. They pinned Julian against the cold marble wall. One guard ripped the charcoal suit jacket off his shoulders. Another pulled the silk tie from his neck. Julian was left standing in his thin undershirt and grey socks. The cold air of the hotel's powerful ventilation system hit his bare skin. He began to shiver. The smell of his expensive cologne was gone. Now, he only smelled of failure and cold sweat. This was the sensory disposal. Alexander turned his back on the chaos. He didn't want Evelyn to see the trash being taken out. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He pulled her flush against his side. The warmth of his body was a sharp contrast to the icy ballroom. "The car is at the private entrance," Alexander murmured. His voice was a low, possessive rumble. "The world knows who you are now, Evelyn. They don't need to see the rest of this." "I want to see him one last time," Evelyn said. She walked to the doorway. Julian was being pushed toward the service exit. He looked at the model he had cheated with. She was standing near the buffet, sipping champagne. "Vanessa, help me," Julian begged. The model didn't even blink. She looked through him as if he were made of glass. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was cold. She turned back to her friends. Julian had no money. Julian had no name. Julian did not exist. This was the identity void. Julian fell silent. He stopped fighting. His eyes went blank. He was catatonic. He was a ghost in his own life. Alexander stepped behind Evelyn. He slid his hands around her waist. He locked his fingers over her stomach. He leaned down and pressed his face into the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply. He took in the scent of her skin, no longer masked by Julian's cheap chemicals. "He's gone, Evelyn," Alexander whispered. His breath was hot. His lips brushed against her earlobe. "You are free, and you are mine." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of ownership. The sexual tension reached a breaking point. Evelyn leaned back into him. She felt the heavy weight of his gold watch against her arm. She felt the raw power of the man holding her. Outside, the rain began to pour. The sound of the storm was a heavy, rhythmic drumming against the glass roof. Alexander led her toward the black limousine waiting in the shadows. He opened the door. The interior was dark leather and smelled of rain and power. He didn't let her go. He pulled her inside, and the heavy door shut with a final, expensive thud. The cameras flashed one last time. The live stream cut to black. Julian stood in the rain outside the service entrance. He was wet. He was naked. He was a nobody. The SR-8 launch was over. The Ghost Queen had taken her throne, and the parasite was finally washed away by the storm.
Watching Julian lose his entire empire and his pants in front of millions of people was the kind of high-definition karma we all deserve to see more often. If you discovered your partner was using your genius to fund their secret lifestyle, would you pull the plug privately or wait for the biggest global stage possible to maximize the damage? Just between us, I almost let him keep his jacket, but taking back every single thread, but with her money felt like the only way to make his erasure truly permanent.